In the dense, shadowy forests of northern Michigan, where the trees stood like sentinels watching over a realm untouched by modern civilization, a chilling rumor began to circulate among the locals. Tales of strange creatures prowling the underbrush were dismissed as folklore, nothing more than drunken stories told by hunters gathered around campfires. But those whispers grew louder, seeping into the minds of even the most skeptical residents of the small town of Gray Lake. It was late October when the first sighting occurred. A group of teenagers, out on a dare to explore the abandoned government research facility deep within the woods, returned to town with wild eyes and trembling voices. They spoke of a creature unlike anything they had ever seen, part man, part wolf, standing over 7 feet tall, with glistening fur that shimmered under the moonlight. They described its piercing yellow eyes and a low growl that rumbled through the trees, sending shivers down their spines. "Just a wolf," the adults scoffed. "Those kids are just trying to scare us." Yet, deep down, many felt a flicker of unease. The forest had always held secrets, but this was something new, something sinister. Among those who listened to the teenager's tale was Sheriff Margaret Halsey, a pragmatic woman who had served the town for over 2 decades. She prided herself on her no-nonsense approach to law enforcement, but as she looked into the eyes of the frightened teens, something gnawed at her. Could there be any truth to their story? She decided to investigate the old research facility herself, dismissing it as a mere urban legend. The facility, once a hub for experimental science, had been abandoned for years. Rumors had swirled about the government's secret projects, but no one had concrete evidence of what had transpired there. Locals said that late-night sounds echoed from the building, howls that pierced the night and made the hairs on the back of one's neck stand on end. As she drove her patrol car along the winding dirt road, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced menacingly across the trees. The air turned crisp, and a sense of foreboding hung thick in the twilight. Pulling into the facility's crumbling parking lot, she stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot loud in the eerie silence. The building loomed before her, a dilapidated shell with shattered windows and peeling paint. Once a symbol of government advancement, it now felt like a tomb, holding secrets too dark to comprehend. Flashing her flashlight, she peered through the broken glass, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal remnants of a chaotic past. Rusted lab equipment, scattered papers, and signs of a struggle. Margaret moved cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The howls that the teenagers had mentioned echoed through her mind, and the weight of the forest pressed in around her. She felt the urge to turn back, to return to the safety of the town and dismiss the fears that loomed in the shadows. But a deeper instinct urged her to press on, to uncover the truth hidden within the walls of the facility. As she made her way through the darkened corridors, a low growl reverberated from somewhere deep inside the building. It was a sound that sent a cold shiver down her spine. Pausing, she steadied her breath, trying to rationalize the noise. "Just the wind," she whispered to herself, though her voice trembled. Then, as she turned a corner, she spotted something that stopped her dead in her tracks. A series of photographs plastered on the wall, yellowed and frayed. They depicted grotesque images of human subjects undergoing bizarre transformations. Each picture showed a different phase of the experiments, from simple tests to horrifying mutations that blurred the line between man and beast. Margaret's stomach churned. This was more than just folklore. The government had indeed been involved in something horrific, something that had gone terribly wrong. The implications were staggering. As she studied the images, her mind raced back to the tales of dogmen, of creatures lurking just beyond the edge of reason. Had these experiments led to their creation? The sound of movement behind her broke her reverie, and she spun around, her flashlight beam piercing the darkness. Her heart raced as the light landed on a hulking figure standing in the shadows. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. A creature with the body of a man and the head of a wolf, eyes glinting like polished gold in the dim light. Panic surged through Margaret as she stumbled back, the reality of the creature before her settling in like a heavy fog. It took a step forward, muscles rippling beneath its thick fur, exuding an aura of primal power. Margaret's instincts kicked in. She reached for her sidearm, heart racing, but the creature didn't attack. It paused, tilting its head as if studying her. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice trembling. The creature growled low in its throat, a sound that reverberated through the empty hallways and made her blood run cold. Its golden eyes fixed on her, a mix of curiosity and predatory instinct flickering within. Suddenly, a cacophony of howls erupted from the depths of the forest, a chorus of voices that echoed in the night, sending the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The creature responded with a fierce growl, its muscles tensing as it turned its gaze toward the exit, as if sensing a threat approaching. Margaret seized the moment, bolting down the corridor and bursting through the door. She raced to her patrol car, fumbling for the keys as the howling intensified around her. The creature followed, its growl morphing into a haunting call that reverberated through the night, a signal summoning its kin. With a trembling hand, Margaret inserted the key and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she peeled out of the parking lot, dirt and gravel spraying behind her. In her rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of the creature standing in the shadows, watching her with those piercing golden eyes, a silent promise of vengeance lingering in the air. As she sped down the winding road, her mind raced. She couldn't shake the image of the creature from her mind. What had the government done? What had they unleashed upon the world? She had to find answers. The townsfolk needed to know the truth about what lurked in the woods, what the government had helped to create. When she returned to Grey Lake, the town was quiet, the only sounds the rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Margaret parked her car and rushed to the sheriff's office, her heart still pounding from her encounter. The weight of the discovery pressed down on her. She needed to gather a team to confront the growing threat before it was too late. As dawn broke over Grey Lake, Margaret summoned her deputies to a meeting. The small office filled with concerned faces. Each member of her team, Deputies Bill and Sarah and new recruit Jason, looked to her for answers. The scent of coffee hung in the air, a stark contrast to the tension thickening in the room. "Listen up," Margaret began, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I just came back from the old research facility and we need to talk about what I found." She shared her experience, her eyes scanning the room to gauge their reactions. Some exchanged skeptical glances, but Bill leaned forward, intrigued. "Dogmen," he scoffed, shaking his head. "You can't be serious, this sounds like a horror movie." "I thought the same thing," she replied, her voice firm. "But I saw it. The facility was part of some government experiment, and I'm afraid they didn't just create one creature. They may have unleashed a whole pack of them." The room fell silent, the gravity of her words sinking in. Jason, the youngest of the group, finally spoke. "What do we do? We can't just sit back and let this thing terrorize the town." Margaret nodded. "We need to organize a search party, go back to the facility, and find out what else is out there. We have to warn the town and prepare for the worst." As they began to strategize, the sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over Grey Lake. But beneath that facade of peace, an undercurrent of dread pulsed through the community. People went about their daily lives, unaware of the danger looming just beyond the forest's edge. That evening, armed with flashlights, rifles, and a sense of trepidation, Margaret and her team made their way back to the research facility. The forest loomed around them, dark and foreboding, branches creaking like ancient bones. Each step felt like a descent into the unknown, the air thick with tension and the scent of damp earth. As they approached the facility, Margaret could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The place felt alive, as if the shadows themselves were watching. She motioned for everyone to spread out, and they fanned out, flashlights cutting through the darkness as they began to investigate. "Stay close," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't know what we're dealing with." They searched room by room, finding more remnants of the past, files detailing failed experiments, cages large enough to hold a man, and strange symbols scrawled on the walls. But it wasn't until they reached the basement that the true horror revealed itself. The air turned icy as they descended the creaking stairs, the darkness pressing in around them. They found a series of cells, each one containing remnants of what could only be described as horrific experiments, chains rusted with age, bloodstains darkening the concrete floor, and faded photographs of subjects in various states of transformation. Margaret's stomach turned. This is what they did, she breathed, the weight of the truth settling heavily on her shoulders. They turned people into those things. Just then, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deeper within the facility, reverberating through the halls like a death knell. The team exchanged nervous glances, adrenaline surging through their veins. "We need to get out of here," Sarah urged, but Margaret shook her head. "Wait," she insisted, steeling herself against the rising panic. "We need to find out what that noise was. It could be one of the creatures, or something worse." As they moved cautiously through the corridors, the air grew colder, a chilling breeze sweeping past them as if warning them to turn back. The atmosphere was thick with dread, and Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the hall, and the group froze. The flickering lights cast an eerie glow, revealing a hulking figure standing at the far end of the corridor. Another dogman, its eyes glinting in the dim light, a predatory gleam reflecting back at them. "Run," Margaret shouted, adrenaline fueling her as they bolted back towards the exit. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl, a sound that resonated deep in their souls, urging them to escape. They sprinted through the twisting corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence, but the creature was fast, too fast. Margaret felt the rush of air as it lunged, its massive form colliding with Jason, sending him crashing into the wall. "No," Sarah screamed, turning back as Jason struggled to regain his footing, the creature looming over him. In a flash, Margaret aimed her rifle, adrenaline surging through her veins as she squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, causing it to howl in pain, but it didn't falter. It turned its gaze on her, eyes burning with fury and hunger. Margaret could see the rage within those yellow eyes, and she felt a primal fear gripping her heart. "Get him out," she yelled to Sarah, who grabbed Jason by the arm and pulled him away from the creature's reach. Margaret backed away, keeping her rifle trained on the beast as it advanced, fury etched in its features. The team made a desperate retreat down the hallway, but the creature was relentless. It charged at them, muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. Margaret fired again, hitting it in the leg, but it only seemed to infuriate the beast more. "We need to split up," Margaret shouted, making a split-second decision. "Draw it away. I'll cover you." "No way," Bill protested, his eyes wide with fear. "We stick together." "Do it," Margaret commanded, her voice sharp. The creature lunged again, and they had no choice but to obey. As the team scattered, Margaret held her ground, adrenaline coursing through her veins as she prepared to face the beast alone. It charged, teeth bared and claws glinting in the darkness. Margaret fired another shot, aiming for its chest, but the creature dodged at the last second, the bullet embedding itself into the wall. It was too fast, too agile. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears as it closed the distance between them. Just as the creature lunged, Margaret sidestepped, narrowly avoiding its massive jaws. She fired again, this time hitting it in the side. The creature stumbled, but it quickly regained its footing, more enraged than before. In the chaos, Margaret spotted her team regrouping at the far end of the hallway. Bill was shouting for her to fall back, but she couldn't abandon her post. She had to buy them time. As the creature snarled, saliva dripping from its fangs, Margaret felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting her town from the horrors that lurked in the shadows. "Come on," she taunted, waving her arms to draw its attention. The creature turned, its golden eyes locking onto her, and she knew she had its focus. With a roar, it lunged again, and this time, she was ready. Margaret fired her weapon, the bullet hitting the creature square in the chest. It let out a pained howl, staggering back, but before she could reload it charged again. The impact knocked her to the ground, her rifle clattering out of reach. The creature loomed over her, a towering mass of fur and muscle, eyes glowing with feral rage. Margaret scrambled to her feet, fear coursing through her veins, but she knew she couldn't give up. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed a nearby metal pipe from the floor and swung it at the beast. The pipe connected with the creature's snout, and it recoiled, momentarily stunned. Margaret seized the opportunity and sprinted toward her team, who had regrouped near the exit. They were frantically searching for a way to escape the facility. "Over here," she shouted, leading them toward a side exit. The creature growled behind her, its growl reverberating through the halls, filling the air with primal fury. As they reached the door, Margaret glanced back, her heart racing as the creature charged after them, fury fueling its every movement. "Go, now," she yelled, pushing her team through the door. They burst into the night, the cool air hitting them like a wave of relief. But there was no time to celebrate. The howls of more creatures echoed through the woods, a chorus that promised no safety. "Get to the car," Margaret shouted, leading the way through the darkened forest. They ran, the adrenaline propelling them forward, but the sounds of pursuit echoed behind them. They reached the patrol car, and Margaret fumbled for the keys, her hands shaking from adrenaline and fear. Bill and Sarah helped Jason into the back seat, while Margaret climbed into the driver's seat, heart racing as she finally found the keys. As she turned the ignition, the engine sputtered before roaring to life. She slammed the gear into drive, tires screeching as they tore away from the facility. The creature's howls faded into the distance, but Margaret knew it wouldn't be the last they'd hear. "Did you see it?" Jason gasped, his face pale. It was real. Margaret gripped the steering wheel tightly, the weight of their experience crashing down on her. "Yes, and there's more of them out there. We need to warn the town." As they drove through the winding forest roads, the tension in the car was palpable. Fear and uncertainty loomed like a dark cloud, threatening to engulf them. The full moon illuminated the trees around them, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. "Where do we go now?" Sarah asked, glancing nervously out the window. "We can't just go back to the station." "We need to find somewhere safe," Margaret replied, her mind racing. "We should head to the community center. It's a central location, and we can gather everyone there." As they made their way through the town, the streets were eerily quiet, the usual hustle and bustle of Gray Lake replaced by an unsettling stillness. Margaret parked the car outside the community center, and they piled out, hearts pounding as they entered the building. Inside, the community center was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the floor. The remnants of a previous event, the tables still adorned with decorations, stood as a stark reminder of normalcy, but the air was thick with tension as they quickly gathered the townsfolk who had come to investigate the commotion. "Everyone, listen," Margaret called out, raising her voice to command attention. The murmurs subsided as the crowd turned to her, eyes filled with confusion and fear. "We need to talk about what's happening in the woods." "What do you mean?" one man asked, his brow furrowed. "We heard gunshots. Is everything okay?" "No, it's not," Margaret replied, her heart racing. "There are creatures in the woods, dogmen. They're real, and they're dangerous. We need to prepare for the worst." A wave of disbelief washed over the crowd, murmurs rippling through the room. "Dogmen? That's just a myth," another voice shouted, skepticism lacing his tone. "I thought so too," Margaret said, her voice firm. "But I saw one, and we're not alone. There are more out there, and they're coming for us." The crowd erupted into chaos, voices overlapping as fear and disbelief clashed. But Margaret raised her hands for silence. "We need to take this seriously. We need to organize a defense and prepare for the possibility of an attack." A man stepped forward, his expression serious. "What can we do? We don't even know how many there are." "First, we need to secure the building," Margaret instructed. "Board up the windows, check the perimeter, and gather any weapons we can find. We can't let them catch us off guard." As the townsfolk began to rally, fear transformed into determination. Margaret watched as they set to work, the urgency of their situation sinking in. It was a race against time, and they needed to be ready for whatever horrors awaited them in the dark. As night descended upon Gray Lake, the community center became a fortress, lights flickering in the windows like beacons of hope. The townsfolk had banded together, boarding up windows and preparing makeshift weapons from whatever they could find: baseball bats, kitchen knives, and hunting rifles. Margaret organized a watch, knowing they had to stay vigilant. She paired off townspeople to keep watch, assigning them to specific posts around the building. The air was thick with tension as they settled into a night of unease, waiting for the horrors lurking just outside. She stood near the entrance, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the glass doors. The sounds of the night filled her ears, rustling leaves, distant owls, and the occasional crack of a branch. Each sound made her heart race, a reminder that danger was waiting just beyond their makeshift sanctuary. Hours passed, and the anxiety in the air grew palpable. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility heavy on her shoulders. She had brought her team here to confront the threat, but now she questioned whether they would be able to protect the town from what was coming. "Sheriff," Bill called softly from his post, his voice tense. "Do you really think they'll come for us?" Margaret turned, trying to mask her own doubts. "I don't know, but we have to be ready. We can't underestimate them." The night stretched on, the darkness enveloping the community center like a shroud. As the clock ticked toward midnight, a sudden howl pierced the air, echoing through the trees, a sound that sent chills racing down her spine. The dogmen were near. Margaret's heart raced as she motioned for the townsfolk to gather around her. "Everyone, stay calm. We need to hold our positions. If they come, we fight." The howl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Fear rippled through the group, their eyes wide with terror. Just as Margaret's mind raced with strategies, a loud crash reverberated against the side of the community center. The crowd jumped, panic erupting as they realized the creatures were attacking. "Get ready," Margaret shouted, raising her rifle. "They're here." The doors rattled as the creatures slammed against them, growls reverberating through the building. The townsfolk scrambled, positioning themselves near the windows, weapons raised in anticipation of the impending assault. The first creature crashed through the door, a hulking figure with wild fur and gleaming yellow eyes. It lunged at the nearest person, a young man who barely had time to react before it was upon him. The man screamed as the creature's claws raked across his chest, and chaos erupted in the room. Margaret fired her weapon, the shot echoing in the chaos as it struck the creature in the side. It howled in pain, but it barely flinched, turning its rage toward her. "Fall back," Margaret yelled, trying to regroup her team as more creatures poured into the community center, filling the room with howls and snarls. The air thickened with fear, and she fought to maintain control amid the chaos. Townsfolk shouted as they swung makeshift weapons, desperately trying to fend off the advancing creatures. The smell of blood filled the air, and Margaret's heart raced as she fought to keep her team together. "Bill, Sarah, stay close," she shouted, but the din of the battle drowned out her voice. She caught sight of Jason, cornered by a dogman as it lunged at him with terrifying speed. Without thinking, she sprinted toward him, adrenaline fueling her movements. She fired her weapon again, the bullet hitting the creature square in the back, but it didn't stop. Margaret dove in front of Jason just as the creature lunged, its claws grazing her arm. She felt a sharp pain, but she pushed through it, determined to protect him. "Get back," she yelled, grabbing Jason and shoving him out of the way as she prepared to fire again. The creature howled, anger echoing in the confines of the community center, but Margaret couldn't focus on her own pain. As she turned to face the creature, it charged again. She squeezed the trigger, but the gun clicked empty. Panic surged through her as she tossed it aside, grabbing the metal pipe from the floor. She swung it with all her might, connecting with the creature's head, and it staggered back, momentarily stunned. But before she could catch her breath, the other creatures pressed in, surrounding them. The chaos continued, and Margaret's heart sank as she realized the battle was not going in their favor. They were outnumbered, and the creatures were relentless. "Everyone, we need to regroup. Head for the back," she shouted, trying to steer the panicked crowd toward the exit. But as they turned, another creature crashed through the window, glass shattering in every direction. Screams erupted as it lunged for a woman near the back, claws raking across her leg. The woman fell, her cries piercing through the cacophony. "No," Margaret screamed, the instinct to save her overpowering. She fought her way through the chaos, adrenaline coursing through her veins as she grabbed the woman, dragging her to safety. The townspeople rallied around her, fighting off the creatures as best as they could. Bill swung a bat at a creature, the force of the impact sending it reeling. But then another howl pierced the air, and Margaret felt a surge of dread as more dogmen poured in through the windows, their growls filling the room. They were losing ground, and the chaos was overwhelming. "Fall back," Margaret shouted again, but the retreat was frantic, people pushing against each other as fear gripped them. She could see the panic in their eyes, and she knew they needed a plan, something to turn the tide. "Grab anything you can use as a weapon," she urged, her voice cutting through the chaos. The townsfolk began to respond, rallying around her as they scrambled for makeshift arms. Jason, still shaken, picked up a chair leg, holding it tightly as he glanced around. "What do we do now?" he asked, fear palpable in his voice. "Stick together," Margaret commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We need to create a barrier and force them back out of the building." As the townsfolk gathered behind her, she led the charge toward the back of the room, pushing furniture against the walls to create a makeshift barricade. The creatures pressed in, snarling and snapping, but they momentarily retreated, allowing them a moment to catch their breath. "Keep an eye on the windows," Bill shouted, moving to the side to watch for any movement. The howls echoed outside, a haunting reminder that the danger was far from over. Margaret could feel her heart racing as she strategized. They needed to lure the creatures out, create a diversion that would buy them time to escape. "We need to split up again," she said, her mind racing. "I'll take a few people to the front and draw them out. The rest of you need to head out the back." "No way," Sarah protested, fear in her eyes. "We can't let you go alone." "I can't let them overwhelm us," Margaret replied, determination etched on her face. "If we work together, we can get everyone out of here. We can't give up." As they discussed the plan, the howls grew louder, reverberating through the walls, and Margaret knew they had to act quickly. She quickly gathered a few townsfolk, Bill, Sarah, and Jason, and motioned for the others to prepare for the retreat. "Get ready to move," she said, her heart pounding. "On my signal, we'll head for the front and draw them out. The rest of you take the back exit and run for the patrol car. We'll meet you there." As they positioned themselves at the front of the community center, Margaret felt the weight of the moment press down on her. The howls outside echoed like a death knell, and she glanced at her team, determination flickering in their eyes. They were ready to fight, ready to defend their town. "Now," she shouted, bursting through the front doors as she raised her weapon. The night was alive with chaos as the creatures swarmed around them, their growls echoing in the dark. Margaret fired her weapon, the bullet striking one of the creatures, but it barely faltered. The team moved in unison, using the distraction to push forward. The creatures lunged, snapping jaws and claws coming at them from every direction. "Keep moving," Margaret yelled, adrenaline surging as she swung her pipe at one of the dogmen, hitting it square in the snout. The creature howled, momentarily stunned, and she pressed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Bill swung his bat, striking another creature, but the sheer number of them was overwhelming. They were surrounded, and Margaret could feel panic creeping in. "Don't stop, we can't let them overtake us," she shouted, fighting back her fear as she pushed her way through the chaos. They had to keep moving, had to draw the creatures away from the others. They fought their way to the edge of the building, glancing back to see the townsfolk retreating through the back exit. "They're getting out," Sarah shouted, relief flooding her voice. "Keep going, we're almost there," Margaret urged, but just then, a creature lunged at her, slamming her into the ground. She gasped as the wind was knocked out of her, and she struggled against its weight. Bill grabbed the creature, pulling it off her as Sarah swung the bat, hitting it in the side. It howled in fury, turning its rage on them, and Margaret scrambled to her feet, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Keep going," Margaret shouted, her voice fierce. "Get to the car." They fought their way toward the patrol car, the growls and howls echoing behind them as they pushed through the darkened trees. Margaret could feel the panic of the townsfolk around her, but they had to escape. They had to survive. As they reached the car, she threw open the doors, urging everyone inside. "Get in, now." Once they were all in, she slammed the door shut and fumbled for the keys. Her heart raced as she finally found them, her hands shaking as she turned the ignition. The engine roared to life and she hit the gas, tearing down the road as the howls faded behind them. As they sped away from the chaos, Margaret's heart raced, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The community center faded into the darkness behind them, a stark reminder of the horrors they had faced. The silence in the car was deafening, punctuated only by heavy breathing and the distant echoes of their fear. Margaret glanced at her team, relief washing over her as she realized they had made it out alive. "Is everyone okay?" she asked, her voice shaky. Bill nodded, but Jason's face was pale, his hands trembling. What just happened?" he stammered, still in shock. "I can't believe any of this is real." "It's real," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "And we need to make sure the town knows. We have to prepare for what's coming." As they drove through the darkened streets of Grey Lake, Margaret's mind raced with the implications of their encounter. They had seen the truth, witnessed the horrors that lurked in the shadows. The town would need to be ready for the reality of what they faced. "Where do we go now?" Sarah asked, glancing nervously at the trees lining the road. "We can't just go back home like nothing happened." "We need to regroup," Margaret said, her voice firm. "We'll head to the sheriff's station and rally the town. They need to know that this threat is real, and we have to prepare." As they drove, the weight of their experience settled heavily in the air. The creatures were out there, lurking in the shadows, and they had barely escaped. But Margaret felt a spark of determination igniting within her. They would face this threat together as a community. They would protect their home and ensure that the horrors they had witnessed would not come to pass again. "We'll figure this out," she assured them, her heart steadying with resolve. "We're going to fight back, together." The morning light broke over Grey Lake, casting a warm glow over the town. The horrors of the night before felt like a distant nightmare, but Margaret knew better. As she arrived at the sheriff's station, the weight of her responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. The town needed her, and she wouldn't let them down. She gathered the townsfolk in the community center once again, her heart pounding as she addressed the crowd. "Listen, everyone," she began, her voice steady but firm. "We faced something last night that we never thought was real, but it is. There are creatures in these woods, and they are a threat to our town." Gasps filled the room, and Margaret took a deep breath, continuing, "We need to band together, prepare ourselves, and take action. We can't let fear control us. We need to stand strong. We can't fight them," someone shouted from the back, disbelief lacing their voice. Margaret held up a hand, silencing the crowd. "I understand your fear, but we've seen what they can do. We need to protect our families and our home. That means we have to prepare to defend ourselves." She felt the weight of their gazes on her, a mixture of fear and determination flickering in their eyes. "We'll form a patrol, organize teams, and gather supplies. We'll strategize and we'll be ready for whatever comes next." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, and Margaret felt a surge of hope. They would fight back against the darkness together. As the meeting continued, plans were made, and a sense of unity began to form among the townsfolk. They were ready to face the horrors that lay beyond their town, and Margaret would lead them into the unknown. Together, they would stand against the creatures of the night and protect the heart of Grey Lake. The battle was far from over, but with their strength united, they would face whatever darkness came their way.